16 years ago, my world shattered into a million pieces, leaving behind a gaping wound that never truly healed. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I was just 7 years old when my parents, the people who were supposed to love and protect me unconditionally, simply vanished. One day they were there, a constant presence, and the next, only an empty house, a hastily scribbled note, and a silence that screamed louder than any argument. I remember standing in our living room, a small, terrified child, clutching a worn teddy bear, as the reality of their absence slowly, agonizingly, sank in. The note, a flimsy piece of paper now etched into my memory, read, "We're sorry. We can't do this anymore. You'll be better off." Better off? Those words became a brand, searing themselves onto my soul, fueling a resentment that festered and grew with every passing year. What followed was a blur of foster homes, unfamiliar faces, and a gnawing sense of abandonment. Each new family was a temporary reprieve, never a true home. I learned to be invisible, to expect nothing, and to trust no one. The constant feeling of being unwanted, a burden, shaped every decision, every interaction. I watched other kids with their parents at school events, their laughter echoing in the hallways, and a bitter ache would settle deep within my chest. I wondered, constantly, what I had done wrong. Why wasn't I enough? That question, a relentless tormentor, became the soundtrack to my lonely childhood. Then, at 23, a phone call changed everything. A distant relative, a lawyer, informed me that my great-aunt Mildred, a woman I barely remembered, had passed away. She had no other living relatives, and her substantial estate, a sprawling property in upstate New York, and a considerable sum of money, was to be divided between myself and my parents. My blood ran cold. They were alive. All these years, all this pain, all this yearning for a family, and they were alive, living their lives somewhere, completely unburdened by my existence. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The resentment I had carried for so long, a dull, constant ache, suddenly ignited into a furious inferno. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had deliberately chosen to erase me from their lives. Now, after 16 years of silence, they were suddenly resurfacing, drawn by the scent of money, an inheritance they didn't deserve. The sheer audacity of it, the cold calculation filled me with a rage I hadn't known I possessed. My great-aunt Mildred, bless her soul, had inadvertently opened a Pandora's box. This wasn't just about money. This was about justice, about reclaiming a childhood stolen, about confronting the ghosts that had haunted my entire life. The lawyer, a stern woman named Mrs. Albright, explained the terms. Aunt Mildred, a woman known for her eccentricities, had stipulated a mandatory family meeting at her estate within 30 days of her passing. All beneficiaries had to be present to discuss the will and decide the fate of her cherished antique collection. It was a trap, a meticulously laid snare, designed to force my parents and me into the same room. A shiver ran down my spine, not of fear but of anticipation. This was my chance to look them in the eye, to demand answers, to finally understand why. The thought of facing them, of seeing the faces that had once represented safety and love, now only conjured images of betrayal and deceit, sent a jolt through me. But this time, I wouldn't be the helpless child. I had grown, I had survived, and I had learned to fight. The obsession to unravel their secrets, to make them account for every tear I had shed, every lonely birthday, consumed me. I began to research, to dig into their past, to piece together the fragments of a life they had so carelessly discarded. What I uncovered was far more sinister than I could have ever imagined, a web of lies and hidden motives that would shake me to my core. Every piece of information I unearthed, every whispered rumor, every forgotten document fueled my resolve. The initial sting of betrayal morphed into a calculated determination. This wasn't just about an inheritance anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about making them face the consequences of their actions. The journey to Aunt Mildred's sprawling, isolated estate in the heart of the Catskill Mountains felt less like a trip and more like a pilgrimage to a reckoning. I knew with every fiber of my being that this confrontation would be explosive, that the truth, when it finally emerged, would leave no one unscathed. This story isn't just about abandonment and a will, it's about a daughter's unyielding pursuit of justice, and the shocking secrets that bind a family together, even after they've torn it apart. What I was about to discover would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my past, and forever alter the course of my future. The chipped paint of the old diner sign, perpetually flickering, cast a dim, unsteady glow across the rain-slicked street. 16 years. 16 years since I last saw the inside of that place. Since the scent of stale coffee and burnt toast was a familiar comfort rather than a distant, painful memory. My name is Alara Vance, and for 16 years that diner, that town, everything, felt like a ghost limb, present in my mind, but severed from my reality. I was just 5 years old when they left me, dropped off at my Aunt Carol's doorstep with a single, hastily packed suitcase and a lie about a temporary work opportunity out of state. That temporary turned permanent, and their calls grew fewer, then stopped entirely. Aunt Carol, God bless her soul, was my anchor. She raised me in her small, quiet house on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, a world away from the dreary industrial town where I was born. She never spoke ill of them, my parents, but the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air between us. They chose their own lives over mine. Resentment, a slow-burning ember, had always lived deep within me. It wasn't a raging inferno, not yet, but a constant dull ache that flared whenever I saw a child holding their parent's hand, or heard a friend talk about their family vacations. I built a life for myself, a good one, despite their absence. I worked my way through community college, then a state university, driven by an almost desperate need to prove I could thrive without them. I landed a decent job in marketing, bought a small condo, and cultivated a tight circle of friends who became the family I chose. Yet, the question always lingered, why? Why me? Why did they abandon me so completely? There were no answers, only the echoes of their silence. Then the phone call came, shattering the fragile peace I'd constructed. It was Aunt Carol's lawyer, his voice a somber drone through the receiver. Aunt Carol had passed away peacefully in her sleep, a heart attack, quick and merciful. The news hit me like a physical blow, stripping away my last remaining link to a genuine, unconditional love. Grief was a tidal wave, pulling me under, but beneath the sorrow, a strange, unsettling undercurrent began to stir. The lawyer mentioned a will, a significant inheritance, and a stipulation that I, Alara Vance, was the sole beneficiary. It wasn't the money that shocked me. Aunt Carol had always been frugal, but not wealthy. It was the way the lawyer's voice dropped, almost a whisper, as he added, "There's also a condition, Alara, a rather unusual one." My heart hammered against my ribs. What could be so unusual? Aunt Carol was eccentric, yes, but always grounded. The lawyer then explained the condition, and his words were like shards of ice, piercing through my grief and igniting the dormant resentment into a furious blaze. Aunt Carol had left me everything, but only if I confronted my parents face to face and made them acknowledge their abandonment. Not just acknowledge it, but explain it, truly explain it, and apologize. A formal, documented apology, witnessed by her lawyer. If I failed, if they refused, the entire inheritance would go to a distant charity, and I would receive nothing. My aunt, in her final act, was forcing my hand. She knew the pain I carried, the unanswered questions, and she had orchestrated a confrontation I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The betrayal wasn't from my aunt, not really, but from the realization of how deeply their absence had scarred me, how even in death, she was trying to heal a wound my parents had inflicted. The thought of facing them, of dragging up those old festering wounds, made my stomach clench. But the idea of letting them off the hook, of allowing them to continue living their lives without ever facing the consequences of their actions, was unbearable. This wasn't about the money, not anymore. This was about justice, about finally getting the answers I deserved, the apology I was owed. This was about Alara Vance, not the abandoned child, but the woman who refused to be silent any longer. The embers of resentment had finally caught fire, transforming into a fierce burning obsession. I had to go back, I had to find them, and they had to look me in the eye and tell me why. The flickering sign of that diner, the one I saw in my mind's eye, seemed to mock me, a symbol of a past I desperately needed to reclaim, or at least understand. My journey, it seemed, was just beginning. The silence that followed the lawyer's call was deafening, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. Aunt Carol, gone. The only person who had ever truly loved me, truly seen me, vanished. It was a cruel twist of fate, a brutal reminder of how fleeting connection could be. My grief, however, quickly intertwined with the familiar tendrils of resentment. Her passing didn't just leave a void in my life, it ripped open old wounds, exposing the raw, festering core of my abandonment. The question of why now screamed louder than ever, demanding an answer that only they could provide. I felt a desperate, almost primal need to confront them, to force them to acknowledge the daughter they had so carelessly discarded. My small condo, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. Every object, every photograph seemed to mock me with its stable permanence, a stark contrast to the fractured foundation of my own identity. I spent days in a blur, sorting through Aunt Carol's belongings, each item a poignant echo of her gentle spirit. Among her keepsakes, tucked away in a worn leather box, I found a faded photograph. It was a picture of a young couple, beaming, holding a tiny baby, me. Behind them, unmistakably, was the flickering sign of that diner. The one from my earliest fragmented memories. The image solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about closure anymore. It was about excavating the truth, about demanding accountability. I booked a flight to the town I had sworn I'd never return to, a place that existed only in the shadowy corners of my mind. The old diner I discovered through a quick online search was still there, a stubborn relic in a town time seemed to have forgotten. My heart hammered against my ribs with a frantic rhythm as the plane descended, each beat a drum roll to an inevitable confrontation. The landscape below, a patchwork of industrial grime and forgotten dreams, looked exactly as I remembered, a grim canvas for my unfolding drama. This wasn't a pilgrimage, it was a declaration of war. Stepping off the plane, the air itself felt heavy with unspoken history, thick with the ghosts of my past. I rented a beat-up sedan, its engine rattling a nervous counterpoint to my own anxiety, and drove directly to the diner. It stood exactly as it had in my memories, its neon sign sputtering, casting a lurid, sickly green glow on the cracked pavement. My stomach churned, a volatile mix of fear and furious anticipation. I parked across the street, watching, a silent predator staking out its prey. Hours bled into one another as I observed the comings and goings, each face a potential clue, each stranger a fleeting hope or crushing disappointment. Then I saw her. A woman, her hair streaked with gray, her face etched with lines that spoke of a hard life, but undeniably, unmistakably, my mother. She emerged from the diner's back entrance, carrying a trash bag, her movements slow and tired. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me. My hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The resentment, once a slow burn, now roared into a raging inferno, consuming every other emotion. How could she look so ordinary, so unremarkable, after all the wreckage she had left in her wake? I watched her walk to a small, run-down house a few blocks away, a house that looked as if it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. My father, I surmised, must be inside. A cold, calculated resolve settled over me. I wouldn't rush this. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of a panicked emotional outburst. I needed a plan, a strategy. This wasn't just about confronting them. It was about making them feel the full weight of their actions, about ensuring they understood the depth of the pain they had inflicted. Aunt Carol deserved that much, and so did I. The next few days were a blur of reconnaissance. I frequented the diner, sitting in a back booth, nursing lukewarm coffee and listening. I overheard snippets of conversation, fragments of lives that had continued without me. My mother, I learned, still worked there, a waitress living paycheck to paycheck. My father, a mechanic, was often seen at a local garage, his hands perpetually stained with grease. Their lives were small, seemingly unremarkable, a stark contrast to the grand narrative of abandonment I had constructed in my mind. This wasn't the lavish, successful life I had imagined they had chosen over me. It was a struggle, a grind. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. One afternoon, I saw my mother arguing heatedly with a man outside the diner. His face was unfamiliar, but his aggressive posture and her tearful retreat spoke volumes. He was demanding money, threatening her. My blood ran cold. This wasn't how I had envisioned their lives. The neat, simple narrative of their abandonment began to unravel, replaced by a more complex, unsettling reality. Yet, the core truth remained. They had left me. No amount of present-day hardship could erase that. If anything, their current struggles only fueled my anger. They had chosen this, chosen to abandon their child for this life. A new layer of bitterness settled in my gut. I had worked tirelessly, clawed my way out of the shadow of their abandonment, built a life of comfort and stability. And for what? To find them living in squalor, seemingly oblivious to the opportunities they had sacrificed for their own selfish desires? The anger sharpened, honing itself into a cutting edge. I still needed answers, but now, a new, more potent desire had taken root. I wanted them to understand what they had lost, to see the successful, independent woman I had become despite their cruelty. I wanted them to regret their choice, deeply and irrevocably. My journey back wasn't just about understanding. It was about making them face the consequences. The drive across state lines felt different this time. Not like an escape, but a deliberate return. Each mile marker that flashed past the window brought me closer to the place I'd spent 16 years trying to forget. The resentment, once a dull throb, now pulsed with a fierce, almost exhilarating rhythm. Aunt Carol's passing had cracked open a door I'd sealed shut, revealing not just old wounds, but a simmering desire for something more than just understanding. This wasn't merely about closure. It was about opening their eyes to the consequences of their abandonment, forcing them to confront the woman I had become, the woman they had so carelessly discarded. My first stop was the old diner, the one with the perpetually flickering sign. It hadn't changed, not really. The same faded red booths, the same scent of stale coffee clinging to the air, the same worn-out counter where I used to swing my tiny legs. I ordered a black coffee, just to feel the weight of the ceramic mug in my hands, to pretend for a moment that I was simply a customer, not a ghost haunting a memory. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda, looked vaguely familiar, but her gaze slid right over me. I wasn't Alara Vance anymore, not to her, not to this town. I was just another face in the crowd, a stranger passing through. That anonymity, surprisingly, gave me a strange sense of power. They wouldn't see me coming. I spent the next few days in the local library, poring over old newspapers, obituaries, and property records. I needed to understand their lives, to piece together the narrative they had chosen for themselves after abandoning me. My parents, Robert and Susan Vance, had apparently stayed in town, living out their lives in the same small, unremarkable way. Robert had continued working at the local manufacturing plant until it closed down a few years ago, and Susan had kept her part-time job at the dry cleaners. Their lives were mundane, predictable, utterly devoid of the opportunities they had claimed to be chasing. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. They had traded a daughter for nothing. The biggest revelation came when I stumbled upon Aunt Carol's will. Her lawyer had mentioned a substantial inheritance, But the details were far more intricate than I had anticipated. Aunt Carol, a woman who lived simply and without fanfare, had been a shrewd investor. Her estate wasn't just substantial, it was significant. More importantly, her will stipulated that the bulk of her fortune was to be divided equally between me and a distant cousin, a woman named Martha, who lived in another state and whom I'd never met. But there was a clause, a single, carefully worded sentence that sent a shiver down my spine. Should Alara Vance's biological parents, Robert and Susan Vance, attempt to contest this will or claim any portion of her inheritance, their claim shall be deemed null and void, and their actions will trigger a series of legal proceedings to investigate their past financial dealings and the circumstances surrounding their abandonment of Alara. Aunt Carol, even in death, was looking out for me, and simultaneously had handed me a weapon. She knew. She must have known the kind of people they were, or at least suspected their opportunistic nature. This wasn't just about money. It was about exposure, about holding them accountable in a way I hadn't even dared to dream. My journey back wasn't just about understanding anymore. It was about meticulously planning their downfall. The resentment had deepened, hardening into something cold and precise. I decided to visit their house, the one I vaguely remembered from my earliest childhood. It was a small, unassuming ranch-style home on the edge of town, the kind of place that blended seamlessly into the backdrop of forgotten American towns. I parked my rental car a few blocks away and approached on foot, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The lawn was overgrown, the paint peeling, a clear sign of neglect. As I drew closer, I saw a familiar car in the driveway, a beat-up sedan, the same model my father had driven all those years ago. It was still running, a testament to his stubborn frugality. I watched for an hour, hidden behind a large oak tree, observing the mundane rhythms of their lives. My mother, Susan, emerged briefly to retrieve the mail. Her once vibrant red hair now streaked with gray, her shoulders slumped. My father, Robert, appeared shortly after, struggling with a broken garden hose, his movements slow and deliberate. They looked ordinary. Older, worn, but ordinary. There was no grand tragedy etched on their faces, no sign of the profound loss they had inflicted. That lack of visible suffering, that apparent normalcy, fueled the fire within me. They had moved on, seemingly without a backward glance, while I had carried the weight of their absence for 16 years. The plan began to solidify in my mind. Aunt Carol's will was a gift, a legal lever to pry open their carefully constructed facade. I would not contest the will. I would simply allow them to make their move. I imagined the scene, their greedy eyes reading the terms, the sudden realization that their long-lost daughter was now a wealthy woman. The temptation would be too great for them to resist, and when they inevitably reached for what they believed was theirs, they would find themselves ensnared in a trap set not by me, but by the very woman who had saved me. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Served cold and precise, with a side of their own past misdeeds. The next step was to make sure they knew about Aunt Carol's inheritance, and more importantly, about my newly acquired wealth. The game was on. The email landed in their inboxes, an anonymous tip crafted with surgical precision. It detailed Aunt Carol's passing, the unexpected inheritance, and, most importantly, the fact that I, their long-forgotten daughter, was the sole beneficiary. I pictured them, wherever they were, their eyes scanning the words, a slow dawning realization spreading across their faces. The bait was set, glistening and irresistible. I wanted them to feel the first tendrils of greed, the insidious whisper of what they had lost. Weeks later, the phone rang, an unknown number, naturally. I let it go to voicemail, a small smirk playing on my lips. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. It was my mother. Her voice, once a vague echo from a forgotten past, now sounded brittle, laced with an artificial sweetness that grated on my nerves. She spoke of catching up, of regretting the distance, of how much she'd missed me. Every word was a lie, a flimsy veil over the true motive I knew simmered beneath. I called her back, a carefully constructed calm in my voice. "Hello?" I asked, as if genuinely surprised. Her relief was palpable, almost pathetic. She launched into a rehearsed spiel about how life had been so complicated, how they'd always thought about me, how proud they were of the woman I'd become. My father, she explained, was just thrilled to hear from me. I listened, my heart a cold stone in my chest, allowing her to spin her web of deceit. I even managed a few well-placed, "Oh, really? And how interesting." The conversation eventually turned to Aunt Carol. My mother offered condolences, feigned sadness, and then, with a subtle shift in tone, inquired about the estate. It was exactly what I'd anticipated. I explained, with a touch of feigned naivete, that Aunt Carol had been quite well off, leaving a substantial sum. I mentioned the house, the investments, the antique collection. I watched the trap snap shut, even though she was thousands of miles away. Their visits started soon after. First, a tentative email suggesting a reunion, then a phone call proposing a trip. I agreed, but on my terms. Not in their old town, not in Phoenix. We would meet in a neutral city, a place where I felt no ghosts, no lingering pain. I chose Denver, a bustling metropolis far removed from the quiet desolation of my childhood. I wanted to see them, to gauge their reactions, to watch them squirm under the weight of their own avarice. The day they arrived, I felt a strange cocktail of anticipation and dread. I stood at the airport gate, a stranger among strangers, waiting for the two people who had shaped my entire life by their absence. When I saw them, a jolt went through me. They looked older, of course, lines etched around their eyes, a weariness in their posture that hadn't been there in the faded photographs Aunt Carol kept. My mother's hair was streaked with gray, my father's once dark hair thinning at the crown. They looked ordinary. Not the monsters I had sometimes imagined, but simply two people who had made a terrible choice. They spotted me, and a hesitant smile spread across my mother's face. My father's eyes, once so distant, now held a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher. Curiosity? Guilt? He approached first, arms outstretched, but I remained rooted to the spot, my expression carefully neutral. He faltered, dropping his hands awkwardly. "Alara," my mother whispered, her voice thick with an emotion I knew was entirely performative. She reached out, but I took a small step back. "Hello?" I replied, my voice cool, detached. The air crackled with unspoken words, with 16 years of silence. This wasn't a reunion, it was a negotiation, a performance. And I, Alara Vance, was about to become their director. I watched their faces, searching for any genuine flicker of remorse, any sign that they understood the depth of the wound they had inflicted. There was nothing, only the hungry glint in their eyes when they spoke of Aunt Carol's generosity. The game was indeed on, and I held all the cards. The silence in the lawyer's office was thick, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the rustle of papers. My parents, their faces a carefully constructed mask of concern, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had just heard the final, unyielding terms of Aunt Carol's will. The house, the modest savings, even her beloved garden gnome collection. All of it was mine, with one crucial stipulation. A trust fund, substantial enough to change lives, was established in my name, but it came with a condition that hit them like a physical blow. As per the deceased's wishes, the lawyer droned, adjusting his glasses, the entirety of the trust will be dispersed to Miss Alara Vance on her 30th birthday, provided she has no contact, direct or indirect, with her biological parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, for a period of 5 consecutive years leading up to that date. The air crackled. My mother's perfectly coiffed hair seemed to stiffen. My father's jaw, usually so slack, clenched tight. Their carefully constructed facade of parental affection crumbled, revealing the raw avarice beneath. This wasn't about me, it was about the money, always had been. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung heavy between us. My mother, her voice a strained whisper, finally spoke. 5 years? No contact? But she's our daughter! The hypocrisy was so blatant, so breathtaking, it almost made me laugh. 16 years they had no contact with their daughter, and now suddenly it was an outrage. I met her gaze. A cold, unwavering stare. You had 16 years to be my parents, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor I felt deep inside. 16 years to be there, to care, to even pretend. Instead, you chose silence. My father, ever the strategist, tried a different tack. Alara, this is absurd. Your Aunt Carol, bless her soul, must have been confused. We can contest this. We are your legal guardians, your next of kin. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Vance, your parental rights were effectively relinquished when you abandoned your daughter at the age of 5. Legally, Ms. Vance has been emancipated by circumstance and by her aunt's guardianship for many years. Furthermore, Aunt Carol was of sound mind, and her will is ironclad. Any attempts to contest it would be futile and frankly expensive. A flicker of desperation crossed my mother's face. But what about our future? We're not getting any younger. We thought you would help us. The sheer audacity of it, the expectation that I, the child they discarded, would now be their retirement plan, was staggering. Help you? I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You left me with Aunt Carol, remember? She was the one who helped me. She was the one who raised me, who loved me, who taught me what family truly means. Not a single card, not a single phone call, not a single moment of concern in 16 years. And now you want me to fund your golden years? Their faces were a study in indignity and dawning realization. The game was indeed on, and they were losing spectacularly. The cards I held were not just Aunt Carol's will, but 16 years of their indifference, 16 years of my quiet resilience. I understand Aunt Carol's intentions perfectly, I continued, my voice gaining strength. She didn't just leave me money, she left me a choice. A choice to finally close this chapter, to sever the last, lingering thread of your influence on my life. And I choose closure. My mother's eyes welled up, but there were no tears. Only a raw, wounded pride. You're just like her, she spat, her voice laced with venom, stubborn, ungrateful. You always were. Perhaps, I conceded, a small, triumphant smile playing on my lips. Perhaps I am. And Aunt Carol taught me well. She taught me to stand up for myself, to value loyalty, and to never let anyone dictate my worth. The lawyer intervened, sensing the rising tension. I believe we've covered all the necessary points. If you have any further questions, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, you may consult your own legal counsel. Ms. Vance, I will be in touch regarding the details of the trust. As I stood to leave, my parents remained seated, their faces pale and defeated. The silence that followed me out of the office was different from the one I'd entered with. This was not the silence of unresolved pain, but the quiet satisfaction of a battle won. The long, drawn-out ache of resentment had finally found its moment of reckoning. Justice, in its own bittersweet way, was being served. The path to my 30th birthday and the full release of Aunt Carol's legacy was now clear. 5 years. 5 years of absolute blissful silence from the people who had once defined my greatest pain. It felt like freedom. That quiet satisfaction was a fragile thing, I would soon discover. 5 years seemed like an eternity, a shimmering horizon of peace I was desperate to reach. My 30th birthday approached with a quiet anticipation, each passing month a victory against the ghosts of my past. I poured myself into my work, found joy in the simple routines of my life, and slowly, painstakingly, began to heal. The constant hum of resentment, once a deafening roar, had receded to a faint whisper, almost imperceptible. I believed I had won. I truly did. The summons arrived 3 weeks before my birthday, a thick envelope with a return address from a dusty law firm in my hometown. My blood ran cold the moment I saw it. It wasn't just a letter. It felt like a curse. A dark omen sent to shatter the fragile peace I'd built. My hands trembled as I tore it open, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes until one phrase leaped out, stark and terrifying, emergency hearing regarding estate of Carol Vance. My stomach dropped. Aunt Carol, what could this possibly mean? She had been gone for years, her estate settled, her wishes meticulously documented. This made no sense. I booked the earliest flight back, my mind racing with 100 impossible scenarios. The familiar, suffocating atmosphere of my hometown hit me the moment I stepped off the plane. The air felt heavy, laden with unspoken histories and forgotten dreams. The law office was a drab gray building, its interior just as unwelcoming. Seated across from the stern-faced attorney, my parents were already there, looking older, more worn, but instantly recognizable. Their eyes, once so dismissive, now held a glint of something I couldn't quite decipher. A desperate hope, perhaps, or a calculated greed. "Miss Vance," the attorney began, his voice devoid of warmth, "it appears there has been a development regarding your aunt's will." He paused, adjusting his glasses, clearly enjoying the dramatic tension. A codicil was discovered recently in a safety deposit box. A codicil dated just weeks before her passing. My heart hammered against my ribs. A codicil? This was new. This was unexpected. This was terrifying. He explained, with excruciating detail, that Aunt Carol, in a last-minute change, had stipulated that if I, Alara, failed to reach my 30th birthday, or if I were deemed unfit by a panel of her appointed trustees, the entirety of her estate would then revert to her next of kin. My parents. Unfit. The word echoed in my ears, a cruel joke. My parents, who had abandoned me, now stood poised to inherit everything if I stumbled. The resentment, dormant for so long, flared to life, hotter and more furious than ever before. Unfit? I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. What does that even mean? My father, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke, his voice raspy. "It means, Alara, that your aunt always had her doubts about your stability. She worried about your independent nature." His words dripped with a condescending pity that made my blood boil. My mother nodded in agreement, her gaze unwavering. A silent accomplice in this new betrayal. They were trying to paint me as unstable, as unworthy, all to snatch away what was rightfully mine. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles, character assassinations, and emotional warfare. My parents, armed with their newly discovered codicil and a shocking lack of shame, launched a full-scale assault on my character. They presented carefully curated evidence of my supposed instability, a forgotten therapy session from my teenage years, a brief period of unemployment after college, even a slightly rebellious phase where I dyed my hair purple. Each accusation was a fresh wound, twisting the knife deeper into the old scars. I fought back, of course. I presented my impeccable work record, my stable finances, testimonies from friends and colleagues, who spoke of my resilience and strength. But the legal system, I quickly learned, could be a murky, unfair beast, especially when fueled by avarice. The trustees, old friends of Aunt Carol, were swayed by my parents' performance, their feigned concern for my well-being. They saw my independence not as strength, but as a dangerous unpredictability. The day of the final hearing arrived, heavy with the weight of my past and the uncertainty of my future. The courtroom was stifling, the air thick with unspoken judgments. My parents sat opposite me, their faces a mask of righteous concern. I looked at them, truly looked at them, and saw not the parents who had abandoned me, but two desperate, broken people, consumed by their own failures and now, by an insatiable greed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about me anymore. This was about them, about their inability to ever truly escape the consequences of their choices. The judge, a severe woman with tired eyes, delivered her verdict. The codicil was deemed valid. The trustees had found sufficient cause for concern regarding my emotional well-being. My inheritance, my legacy from Aunt Carol, was to be held in trust, with my parents as the primary beneficiaries of its dividends, until I could prove my stability through a series of ongoing evaluations. It was a partial victory for them, a devastating blow to me. As the gavel struck, a wave of profound, unexpected calm washed over me. The resentment, the anger, the pain, it all dissolved, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. They hadn't won, not really. They had gained money, yes, but they had lost something far more valuable. Their last shred of dignity, their last chance at redemption. They would live with the knowledge that they had once again chosen greed over their own child, that they had publicly shamed me for their own gain. And I, Ilara, I was free. Free from the illusion that they could ever change, free from the hope that they would ever truly care. This wasn't justice in the way I had imagined, but it was a resolution, a bittersweet, hard-won peace. I walked out of that courtroom, not defeated but finally truly free. The courtroom doors swung open, a heavy, echoing thud that seemed to seal my fate. Every eye in the room was fixed on me, Carol, the woman who had dared to stand against the very people who gave her life. My parents, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and feigned indignation, sat across the aisle. Their lawyer, a slick-haired shark, had just finished painting me as a bitter, greedy child, driven by spite. But the truth, the raw, ugly truth of my abandonment, was about to be laid bare. I walked to the stand, my heart a drum against my ribs, but my gaze steady. The judge, a stern woman with kind eyes, nodded for me to begin. Taking a deep breath, I started not with legal arguments, but with a story. I spoke of the day they left me, a terrified 5-year-old, at my aunt's doorstep. I described the confusion, the crushing weight of rejection, the endless nights I cried myself to sleep wondering what I had done wrong. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the occasional sniffle from the gallery. I saw my mother flinch, her carefully constructed facade finally cracking. My father, however, remained impassive, a stone wall of indifference. Then I pivoted to Aunt Martha. I painted a picture of her unwavering love, her tireless efforts to give me a normal life, despite her own struggles. I spoke of her quiet strength, her resilience, and the profound impact she had on shaping me into the woman I am today. The inheritance, I explained, wasn't just money. It was Martha's final act of love, a testament to the family she chose, the family that truly cared. And how, in their greed, my biological parents had tried to snatch that last vestige of her affection from me. The cross-examination was brutal. Their lawyer tried to twist my words, to portray me as ungrateful, as someone who was only after money. He brought up every perceived failing, every childhood mistake, trying to chip away at my credibility. But with each question, I held firm, my voice unwavering, my conviction unshakable. I wasn't just fighting for money, I was fighting for Martha's legacy, for the recognition of her love, and for the right to finally stand up for myself. Then came the moment of reckoning. The judge, after hearing all the testimony, delivered her verdict. The judge's voice, clear and firm, cut through the tension. She cited the clear intent of Aunt Martha's will, the documented evidence of my parents' abandonment, and the overwhelming testimony of my aunt's neighbors and friends who had witnessed her devotion to me. My parents' claims, she declared, were baseless, a transparent attempt to exploit a situation for financial gain. The inheritance, every last cent of it, was rightfully mine. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. But it wasn't just relief. It was something deeper, more satisfying. It was justice. My parents stared, their faces a mask of disbelief and fury. My mother's eyes, usually so cold, now burned with a raw, ugly anger that confirmed everything I had always suspected. They hadn't wanted me, and now they wouldn't get a penny of what they felt entitled to. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The weight of their abandonment, of their constant shadow over my life, had finally lifted. I had faced them, not with bitterness or anger, but with truth and dignity. The money was important, yes, a security I had never known. But the true victory was reclaiming my narrative, defining my own worth, and honoring the woman who had truly been a mother to me. I looked at the sky, a vast, endless blue, and felt Martha's presence. She would be proud. The road ahead was still mine to forge, but now I walked it unburdened, finally free from the ghosts of a past I didn't deserve. The closure was bittersweet, a reminder of what I had lost, but also a celebration of what I had found, my own strength, my own voice, and a future built on love, not resentment.